Clay, we're all familiar with elections in the modern era, but how did they start out? How were they meant to work?
Well, let's go back to constitutional basics. A constitution is a recipe for the ordering of public affairs in a society. You know, if you had a society of 300 million people, as we do, and there were no government, it would be very interesting to see how anything got done. I mean, who drives on which side of the street? Are there traffic signals? Is a contract valid under all circumstances? Can it be challenged? What if somebody tries to break into my house? You know, societies need order, and they create a social compact. Now, in a Native American society, it might not be a written constitution. It might be a series of liturgies and rituals and hunting and planting societies and so on. But in our culture, it's a written, formal constitution with a social contract in it. So then the question becomes, if you have a government, who's in it? Is it a king? Is it a, you know, who do you put in this government, and under what circumstances, and how do they connect with the 300 million Americans? And so the real breakthrough of the Enlightenment was the principle of representation. The ancient world did not really have a full principle of representation. It evolved in the early modern world. And so under our system, instead of every one of the 300 million Americans going into a public place and voting all at the same moment, that is being in a real democracy, we decided we'll have representatives, that every X number of people will choose a delegate from amongst themselves who will go off and represent their interests in the public councils. And so that's the origin of representation. Once you have that concept, then the question is, how long is that person empowered? How do you elect him or her? Do you have a different system for the House and the Senate? Do they need to be naive representatives of you, or do you sort of empower them to go do good things on your behalf? When you get tired of them, how do you rein them in? So we had to create a constitution that found mechanisms to, in a sense, to distill the will of the American people in a way that got things done, but didn't aggrandize those legislators to the point that they forgot the citizens back home.
Now, how did they come up with the concept of having one way of doing things in the House and then a much slower way of doing things in the Senate? I mean, it's certainly a deliberative body, much more so than the House.
Yeah, it's a great and interesting historical legacy of the early republic. The idea was that you want a people's government. That's the House of Representatives. And there was a debate at the Constitutional Convention. Should we have them for 3-year terms or 1-year terms? And eventually they cut the difference and made it 2. The idea is keep them really tightly tethered to the public. You know, a representative has to come back all the time to his or her constituency, and has to stand for re-election every 2nd year, and so they can't veer very far. So if the congresswoman from Montana votes in a way that's really offensive to Montanans, they'll punish her at the next election, and it's so close to today, of the day of the vote, that she has to stay accountable, whereas a senator with a 6-year term might be able to do something in her 2nd year that's very controversial, and the public has time sort of to calm down and absorb it before they go to the polls. But the idea was, we have to have a Congress that's really responsive to the people. But then they said, well, wait a minute, that might be a mistake, because maybe it's too responsive. Maybe the people suddenly one day decide they want to inflate the currency, or go to war against Canada, or banish all Hungarians. How do you listen to the will of the people and have a body in government that's really responsive to them? At the same time, there's some way to keep that from running out of control. So they thought, we'll do 2 different mechanisms, 1 2-year terms, 1 6-year terms. And then they did something else very interesting. A congressman is a national figure from a state, but a senator then was a state-generated entity. In other words, the Senate until the 20th century consisted of people who were appointed by the state legislature. So imagine the legislature of Minnesota deciding which 2 senators they wanted to send off to Washington. The idea was that that's a different method of representation. One is voting by the people. The other is at one remove. The people vote their legislature. The legislature then votes for two people that it wants to send off to the United States government. So this is the old state versus nation problem. The Senate is a state-based voting system, theoretically. The House is a national voting system, theoretically. The paradox of it, Sam, is that in our time, senators are frequently more national figures than congressmen. Now, congressmen have to be very good about constituencies because they have to keep getting reelected. A senator from Florida has so much, is abstracted so significantly from the public that he or she has less need to be directly responsive. And so it's actually worked out almost in an opposite way from what was intended.
When did we see the change from the way the Senate was elected to what we have now?
From 1788 to the 19th, let me start again. From 1787, when the Constitution was written, until 1913, senators were selected by state legislatures. In the progressive era, the idea was that the people should be in charge and that the people should be more connected to both their representatives and their senators. The problem with having senators appointed by state legislatures is that, let's say in Montana during the era of the big copper monopolies, if the legislature is sort of a copper legislature, then they're going to send pro-mining people off to Washington. The people in the progressive era thought, well, if we get control of our two senators, they might be able to challenge these mining monopolies and the railroads and the agricultural interests. And so part of the progressive reform was that there should be direct election of senators. And that was the 17th Amendment, and it was passed on February 3rd, 1913. And since then, from 1913 until today, senators have been elected by the people of all of the states.
Where did the Electoral College come from? The concept and how it actually works versus the popular vote?
Well, it's sort of related, Sam, in a certain way. First of all, you have the House and the Senate, so we've talked about that, the different methods of election. And because the Senate was having a 6-year term, it was meant to be kind of senior statesmen who would slow things down, would bring some wisdom to this that maybe wasn't always evident in the more volatile House. And so this was meant to be kind of a way of distilling the will of the people in a more deliberative manner. You know, the Senate and the House have to concur on legislation. There have to be conference committees. Then the president is from another branch of government altogether. You know, Article 1 of the Constitution is the legislative branch, the most important branch. Article 2 of the Constitution is the executive, the president, and Article 3 is the judicial branch. The president could not be directly elected. I mean, physically, he couldn't be directly elected. You couldn't have a national election in the United States in the year 1800. There wasn't an infrastructure for it. So the Founding Fathers wanted something like a direct national election of the president. They literally couldn't think of a mechanism to do it. And so they thought, we'll create a system whereby in every state, people vote for electors, and those electors then will either send in their votes or they will meet. It's kind of almost like a college of cardinals in the papacy. But they thought from a logistical point of view, you have to create some sort of a mechanism to get from Georgia and New Hampshire to the national government of the United States. So the Electoral College is sort of a holding tank for the will of individual states to come in the fall of the election year. It wasn't really meant to be an anti-democratic entity. It has some of that legacy, but it was really meant to be a way to handle the only figure in the country who is a national figure. A Supreme Court figure is a judge. It doesn't matter really where she or he is from. A senator from Connecticut is always from Connecticut. There's only one truly national figure in our system, and that is the president. And so they had to find a way to take 13 states and distill them into a national election.
Here are a few questions to think about and discuss. Question 1. The founders wanted the Senate to be elected by a different principle from the House of Representatives. Why did they consider that important? Question 2. Do you think the idea of 2 senators for each state, but representatives according to the size of the population of each state, is fair? Question 3. Should the Electoral College be continued reformed, or abolished? Question 4. In the 21st century, is a 4-year presidential term too long or too short? Question 5. Originally, senators were appointed by state legislatures. This was changed by the 17th Amendment. Was that a wise change?
So in talking about the Electoral College, it benefits small states, but does not benefit big states. So if you had a popular vote, then candidates would only have to campaign in the bigger states to be able to get the majority of voters. How is this imbalance addressed?
Well, I mean, the Founding Fathers' big crisis all through the period between May and September of 1787 was, what will happen to the states? In a national constitution, will there still be states in any meaningful sense? That was the first question. And the second question was, what will happen to the small states? Because if you have a system of proportional representation, then Virginia is going to be powerful, and Pennsylvania is going to be powerful, and New York's going to be powerful, but Rhode Island's going to be powerless. And so the great compromise that was worked out in the summer was that the Senate will have 2 senators from each state, irrespective of population and size, and the House will be more proportional. Once the great compromise occurred, everything else sort of fell into place, because now states like Delaware and Connecticut and Rhode Island realized they weren't just going to be eaten alive by these monolithic states like Virginia and Pennsylvania. So then in the Electoral College, this principle is perpetuated that a small state matters, that we began as 13 countries. Individual colonies become states, become sort of republics. So we have 13 of them, and they didn't want to just fold into the nation. They wanted to preserve state sovereignty. Thomas Jefferson, even late in life, spoke of his country as Virginia, not as the United States, but Virginia was his country. And so the Founding Fathers were very interested in preserving this sort of a balance, and the 10th Amendment is one example of that. The Electoral College means that you can't be president of the United States without paying attention to all the states. In effect, Sam, it gives the small states way more power than they deserve. I mean, I'm from North Dakota, you're from Nevada. In some sense, why should political figures in a nation of 300 million have to spend a lot of time in little out-of-the-way states? They do. If you had a direct presidential election and the Electoral College were abolished, there would be no significant reason ever to step into the state of Wyoming or Alaska or North Dakota or South Dakota, and would work up possibly even to Nevada.
Let's talk about when did modern elections begin, and how did we know that?
Well, first of all, let me describe elections in the age of Jefferson. Very different affairs. Here's Virginia. In Virginia, on election day, there would be a park or a city square of some sort, and people would come in their horses and carriages, and there'd be picnics and barbecues, and people would get their horses shoed and buy all their stuff. And you go over to the election, and there was punch and whiskey and Applejack and lots of food. Very sort of a 4th of July festival kind of atmosphere. And then there'd be a table, and the sheriff or the local judge would be sitting in the middle, and there would be a ballot box for person X and a ballot box for person Y. And one by one, the citizens of that community would come up and put a ballot literally in the box of the candidate of their choice. And so no secret balloting. Lots of coercion, lots of alcohol flowing. That system was not a very effective system. In Jefferson's time, a candidate couldn't really campaign. When Jefferson stood for the presidency in 1800, he told Madison, "I will agree to stand for this office on the condition that I need make no public appearances." Jefferson didn't campaign, Adams didn't campaign, Washington didn't campaign, and so on and so forth. We didn't get to anything like a modern system until well into the 20th century. Really the first people who did this were William Jennings Bryan and Theodore Roosevelt. Even President McKinley, when he stood for re-election in the year 1900, had a house in Canton, Ohio, and he sat on a rocking chair. He made no public appearances. And people could come if they wanted in delegations and get off the train and come up to his porch, and he would sit on the rocking chair and he would say hello and make no promises of any sort. and that was as much campaigning as he would do. And in 1904, when Theodore Roosevelt stood for re-election, he so wanted to do what modern candidates do, to stump the country, to give 1,000 speeches, to shake every hand, to kiss every baby, to go out amongst the people. He was able to do that as vice president for McKinley. He wasn't really able to do that as president. It wasn't thought to be seemly. And so it isn't really till much later that this developed. So when we think about campaigns, we think of the rally. The president flies in, the motorcade takes the candidate to the great convention hall. There's a speech, there's a lot of handshaking, there's a media blitz. That didn't happen until really World War II, and it's accelerated every election cycle since. So the Founding Fathers had a much different system in mind.
Here are some more discussion questions. Question 6. The idea of a two-house Congress was to slow legislation down, but that was the 18th century. Should the system work faster and more efficiently today? Question 7. Why did the Founding Fathers create an Electoral College? Question 8. The two-party system was not intended by the Founding Fathers, who disliked the idea of political parties. What is the use of political parties today? Question 9. Is the idea of states' rights and state sovereignty still a good one? Question 10. In the electronic age, should we move towards direct electronic elections without the need for polling places?
All right, so this begs the question, if the presidential candidates weren't out there campaigning, how did you get to know who they were? How did you get to know who to vote for?
It's an interesting question, Sam. I mean, in a certain sense, we don't really know. But Jefferson wrote a letter to Elbridge Gerry in 1799, who's a friend of his. We get the word gerrymander from this. Wrote him a letter sort of saying what his platform was, but it was a private letter from one citizen to another. And Gerry immediately recognized that it was basically Jefferson's presidential platform. So he made copies of it and sent it to other people, and extracts from it wound up in the press. And people wrote pamphlets on Jefferson's behalf or on John Adams' behalf, and preachers talked about it, but there was no media. There were several hundred newspapers scattered over the country. Most of them were weeklies. There was very little communication across the vast forests of this country. And so it's not even clear how this happened. And by the time of the election, people knew Jefferson stands for democracy and liberty, and he likes France. Adams likes Britain, and he hated the French Revolution, and he didn't make us go to war with the French in 1798. They had a little shadowy notion of the difference between the two people, but it didn't come from them. Jefferson was elected, and most of the 6 million Americans who existed at that time never saw an image of him in the whole course of their lives. They couldn't have told you who Thomas Jefferson was if they met him on the street. No speeches, no audio of any sort, no video, of course, no photographs. Not even really any illustrations. There were political cartoons, and they're quite extraordinary, but they were caricatures. It was just a much different world in which people had kind of a vague notion of which party stood for which, but it would be unrecognizable to a person today who has internet access and cable news 24 hours a day and sees, if you're in the election of 1992 or 2000 or 2008 and you're a citizen of the United States, you cannot go to the polls in November and say you did not get a chance to hear from the candidates. My goodness, have you heard from the candidates in our culture?
Let's talk about how districting came about and then redistricting, as you brought up gerrymandering.
Well, it's an interesting problem. In the beginning, the Constitution is silent about whether there need to be districts. The thought was maybe Pennsylvania would just create a slate of congressmen, but that they didn't have to come from any specific region of the state. The Constitution is silent on that question. Congress eventually created the districts. Makes perfect sense. It had been done in the states already. Well, if you're going to have districts, let's say that in the state of Pennsylvania there are, at some point or other, there are 20 districts. You have to create them so the population is roughly the same. And so how do you carve up a state that's partly rural and partly urban so that you have 20 districts and the population in each is about the same as everywhere else? Once you do that, let's say you do that in 1840, there's a census is required by our Constitution every 10 years for this purpose. You do this in the 1840s, and then there's migration, and a city starts up in the western part of Pennsylvania, which soon displaces a lot of the internal population. Now when you redistrict, you have to recut those lines so that you create roughly equal districts again. And there are now scientific computer models to do this. Today we try to do it so that the districts are truly representative of the multicultural flavor of the people. In Thomas Jefferson's time, they were just seeking out to get the numbers right.
And when did politics come into redistricting? Because you see some fascinating districts carved out across the country that are to protect or to affect a person's election or re-election possibilities.
Well, today the two parties have come to a very, what I would regard as corrupt agreement to create sort of permanent Republican and permanent Democratic districts. They've sort of agreed that they'll have a rough equality of districting and that they won't shake this up too much, which is a terrible mistake because it takes the people in a large part out of the equation of electing their own representatives. But it began from the beginning. The word gerrymander comes from Elbridge Gerry, and he was in Massachusetts, and he helped to redistrict Massachusetts. And one of the districts was set up that it was very long and squiggly, and it looked like a salamander. And because it was done this way, there was no sense of a Jeffersonian square. Because it was done to kind of maneuver around and pick up voters here and voters there, this salamander district led to the coinage of the term gerrymander, meaning manipulating the districting for the advantage of one candidate or one party over others. That goes back to the founding generation. So there's nothing new about this, but what's new about it today is this kind of ugly agreement the parties have made that they're not going to shake the status quo. Ideally, if we lived in a republic, we would send this to computer modeling headed by political scientists, and we would say, here's the state of Oregon, redistrict it so that there are a virtually identical number of people in X number of districts. If that were done, we'd have a much more truly democratic system than we have, but neither party is really very eager to do that. And as you know, Sam, the incumbency return rate in the United States Congress is over 90%. We've basically created the possibility of a permanent government system of permanent representatives and permanent senators, and the only time that something goes wrong is if there's a major national shift or that person commits corruption or crimes.
Let's wrap this up by looking at the thought that elections only really work, especially on a national level, if the will of the people is taken into account.
How do you distill the will of the people? You know, it's one thing in a community of a couple of 100,000 people or 20,000 people. But how do you distill the will of a people in a nation of 300 million when you have a north and a south, an east and a west, you have agricultural districts and commercial districts, you have every type of geography and climate. How do you actually take this mass of 300 million Americans and find a way to distill out of it the will of the people? Well, the system we created was a system of representation. And you know, I don't have any particular judgment about how well it works, but I think most Americans feel that it is a highly imperfect distillation mechanism, that their will, somebody living in, say, Roundup, Montana, or Elko, Nevada, or Winona, Minnesota, they vote and they participate, and then later they think, well, why is it so imperfectly representing my will? I thought the whole point was that it was supposed to represent me. So there's this kind of frustration in the system. And because of that, during the progressive era, a number of mechanisms were created to sort of fix that problem: initiative, recall, referendum. In initiative, the people can create their own law. In referendum, the people can say, hey, the law you guys did down at the legislature doesn't represent us. We're referring it. We're going to see whether we want that to pass. California is the most famous state for initiated measures in our time. These were designed to perfect a highly imperfect distillation system, but no one in our time believes that that has solved the problem either.
then what?
Well, you know, it's time for a new progressive era probably in which we we live in a computer age, we live in an age of almost unbelievable electronic communication, access, and information. It would be possible for the first time in the history of humankind to have mass democracy. You know, it would literally be possible. Let's say that the United States is poised to go to war with Canada. It would be possible for the president to say, on Tuesday night next week, I want all of you to be home. We're going to have a national debate about this. We want you then to vote, to express your opinion, not only by voting, but by writing comments. And we will canvass the nation and get as many of the 300 million Americans as possible to weigh in on a decision of this magnitude as we possibly can. It's not unthinkable that just as initiative, referendum, and recall were innovations of the progressive era, it's not impossible to think that in the 21st century we could have a series of re-empowerments of the will of the people through electronic mechanisms. Whether it will happen or not is an interesting question, but technologically it is now available, and if there were a new progressive movement in this country, it would surely push for something of that sort.